The last thing you expect when you're balancing a tray of expensive wine is to overhear your husband of 7 years planning his new life with another woman. But there I was, standing frozen behind a marble pillar at Rosewood Bistro, listening to David describe our anniversary trip to Cabo as the perfect cover story for his weekend getaway with his supposed business client. The crystal glasses on my tray clinked together as my hand started to shake, and I realized that everything I thought I knew about my marriage was about to shatter like those delicate stems. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My shift at Rosewood Bistro started like any other Thursday evening in October. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves through downtown Portland, and the restaurant buzzed with its usual upscale energy. I tied my black apron around my waist and checked my reflection in the staff mirror, smoothing down my blonde hair that I'd pulled into a professional bun. 3 months of serving tables had given me confidence I never knew I possessed, even though David had initially been skeptical about me taking the job. "We don't really need the money, Nat," he had said back in July, his tone carrying that subtle condescension I'd grown accustomed to over the years. "I'm doing well enough at Summit Creative to support us both." But I had insisted, claiming I wanted to contribute to our savings for the house renovation we'd been planning. The truth was more complicated. After 6 years of being David's dutiful wife, handling his social calendar and supporting his career ambitions, I craved something that belonged entirely to me. Carmen Rodriguez, the owner of Rosewood Bistro, had hired me despite my lack of experience. She was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair and an intuitive understanding of people that made her an exceptional businesswoman. During my interview, she had studied me with dark, perceptive eyes and said, "You've got good instincts." I can tell. Sometimes that matters more than experience. Now, as I checked my section assignments for the evening, Carmen approached with her usual purposeful stride. "Natalie, I'm giving you table 12 tonight. It's a business dinner, should be straightforward. 2 people, reservation under Parker." My stomach did a small flip. "Parker? As in David Parker?" Carmen raised an eyebrow. "Your husband? He didn't mention he was dining here tonight?" I forced a smile, though confusion swirled in my mind. "He said he had a client dinner, but he didn't specify where." What a coincidence. But even as I said it, something felt off. David knew I worked at Rosewood Bistro. If he had made a reservation here, wouldn't he have mentioned it? Wouldn't he have requested a different server to avoid any awkwardness? "Well, this should be interesting," Carmen murmured, her expression unreadable. "Professional as always, of course." The evening crowd began filtering in around 6 o'clock. I served my other tables mechanically, my attention constantly drifting to the empty table 12 in the corner. It was positioned perfectly for a private conversation, tucked behind a decorative marble pillar that created an intimate alcove. David had always been strategic about choosing restaurants and seating arrangements for his business meetings. At exactly 7:15, I spotted David walking through the front entrance. He wore his navy blue suit, the expensive one I had helped him pick out for important client presentations. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and he carried himself with the confident swagger that had first attracted me when we met at a marketing conference 8 years ago. But tonight, something about his demeanor struck me as different. He seemed almost excited, energized in a way I hadn't seen in months. Behind him walked a woman I didn't recognize. She was tall and elegant, with auburn hair that caught the restaurant's warm lighting. Her black dress was sophisticated and clearly expensive, and she moved with the kind of confidence that suggested she was accustomed to fine dining establishments. This must be V. Kane, the potential client David had mentioned briefly over breakfast that morning. "Got a new prospect meeting tonight," he had said, not looking up from his phone as he scrolled through emails. "Could be big for the agency. Might run late, so don't wait up." I had nodded absently, focused on getting ready for my own workday. Now, watching them being seated at table 12 by Marcus, our host, I felt a strange knot forming in my stomach. Something about their body language seemed off for a business meeting. They sat closer together than necessary, and when David helped her into her chair, his hand lingered on her shoulder for just a moment too long. Marcus caught my eye and nodded toward the table, indicating it was time for me to approach. I grabbed menus and took a deep breath, steeling myself for what would surely be an awkward interaction. How exactly does one serve their own husband without creating a scene in an upscale restaurant? As I approached table 12, David was leaning forward, speaking in low tones to the woman across from him. Neither of them noticed me until I was standing directly beside their table. "Good evening," I said in my practiced server voice. "Welcome to Rosewood Bistro." David's head snapped up, and for a split second, his face went completely pale. Then, so quickly I almost missed it, his expression shifted to one of surprised delight. "Natalie. What a wonderful surprise. Vanessa, this is my wife, Natalie. Honey, meet Vanessa Kane from Portland Development Group." Vanessa extended a perfectly manicured hand, her smile polished and professional. "So lovely to meet you, Natalie. David speaks about you constantly." Her voice was smooth and cultured, with just a hint of East Coast sophistication. I shook her hand, noting the expensive jewelry and the way her eyes didn't quite meet mine. "Pleasure to meet you as well. David mentioned he had an important client dinner tonight, but he didn't tell me it would be here." "Last-minute decision," David said quickly. "Vanessa suggested this place, and I remembered you mentioning the excellent reviews." He was lying smoothly, but I caught the slight tightness around his eyes that appeared whenever he was being deceptive. "Well, you're in excellent hands," I replied, falling into my professional rhythm. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" David ordered a bottle of the Cabo Cabernet, a wine that cost more than I made in tips on a good night. As I walked away to retrieve their wine, my mind raced with questions. Why hadn't David mentioned that his meeting would be at my workplace? Why did Vanessa seem more like a dinner date than a business client? And why was David ordering our most expensive wine for what should have been a professional interaction? I returned with the wine and went through the tasting ritual with David, though he barely seemed to notice the process. Both he and Vanessa ordered the restaurant's most expensive entrees, and their conversation resumed the moment I stepped away from the table. I tried to focus on my other customers, but I found myself stealing glances at table 12 throughout the evening. From a distance, their interaction looked increasingly less like business and more like an intimate dinner between two people who knew each other very well. Vanessa laughed frequently at David's comments, touching his hand across the table. David's posture was relaxed and flirtatious in a way I recognized from our early dating days but hadn't seen directed at me in years. Around 8:30, I approached their table to check on their meals. As I neared, I could hear fragments of their conversation over the ambient restaurant noise. "The Portland project timeline works perfectly," Vanessa was saying. "If we can finalize everything by Christmas, the transition will be seamless." "Absolutely," David replied. "And the relocation package you mentioned is more than generous. Natalie has no idea how much her life is about to change." I stopped short, hidden behind the marble pillar that separated their alcove from the main dining area. Relocation package? What was he talking about? "You haven't told her about Seattle yet?" Vanessa's voice carried a note of surprise. "I wanted to make sure everything was locked in first," David said. "She's going to be thrilled. A fresh start, new city, and she'll finally have the time to focus on our family planning without the distraction of this serving job." My heart began pounding so hard I was certain other diners could hear it. Seattle? Family planning? What conversation was I accidentally eavesdropping on? "I have to admit," Vanessa continued, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone, "I'm excited about having you closer. These monthly trips to Portland have been wonderful, but having you in Seattle permanently will be so much better." The wine bottle I was carrying suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Monthly trips? David traveled occasionally for work, but he'd never mentioned regular trips to Seattle. He'd never mentioned Vanessa Kane before this week. And he certainly hadn't discussed any job opportunity that would require us to relocate. "Once we're both in Seattle and settled," David said, his voice warm with affection, "we can finally stop sneaking around. I hate having to pretend we're just business associates." The words hit me like a physical blow. I pressed my back against the marble pillar, grateful for its solid support as my legs threatened to give out beneath me. Business associates. They were having an affair, and David was planning to move us to Seattle to be closer to his mistress. I know it's been difficult, Vanessa replied sympathetically. But it'll all be worth it once you're officially divorced and we can be together openly. The job at Morrison & Associates is perfect for you, and the salary increase will more than cover both your expenses and whatever settlement you'll need to give Natalie. Divorced. The word echoed in my mind like a gunshot. David was planning to divorce me, relocate to Seattle for a job I'd never heard of, and start a new life with a woman he'd been secretly seeing for months. Meanwhile, I had been working evening shifts at a restaurant to help save money for home improvements on a house we apparently wouldn't be keeping. She really has no idea about any of this? Vanessa asked. David's laugh was cold and calculating. Natalie trusts me completely. Always has. She believes everything I tell her without question. It's actually made this whole process much easier than I expected. I closed my eyes, fighting back the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 7 years of marriage, and this was how my husband talked about me to his mistress. As someone gullible and trusting, someone easily deceived and manipulated. What about the timeline? Vanessa pressed. I'd like to have you moved up by Christmas so we can spend the holidays together. Perfect timing, actually, David replied. I'll tell her about the divorce right after Thanksgiving. By then, I'll have already secured the apartment in Seattle and given my notice at Summit Creative. She'll be so shocked she won't have time to complicate things legally. They continued discussing logistics while I stood frozen behind the pillar, my entire world crumbling around me. David had orchestrated every detail of leaving me, from the new job to the apartment to the timing of our divorce announcement. I had been living with a stranger who was systematically planning to destroy our marriage while maintaining a facade of normalcy. The worst part was realizing how naive I'd been. The late nights he'd attributed to work deadlines. The business trips that lasted longer than necessary. The way he'd grown distant and distracted over the past 6 months. The signs had all been there, but I'd chosen to trust him instead of questioning inconsistencies in his stories. I should probably wrap this up soon, David said, checking his watch. Natalie's shift ends at 10, and I told her I'd be home around 11. Need to maintain appearances for a few more weeks. Appearances. That's all our marriage had become to him. A performance he was enduring until he could make his escape to Seattle and his new life with Vanessa Kane. I forced myself to step away from the pillar and return to the kitchen, my movements mechanical and robotic. Carmen was reviewing the evening's receipts when I approached, and she immediately noticed my distress. Natalie? You look like you've seen a ghost. What's wrong? I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. How do you explain that you've just discovered your entire marriage is a lie? That your husband is planning to abandon you while pretending everything is normal? Is it table 12? Carmen asked, her voice gentle but perceptive. Your husband's table? I managed a weak nod, still unable to trust my voice. Carmen studied my face for a moment, then placed a firm hand on my shoulder. Take a breath. Whatever you just heard, we're going to figure this out together. But right now, you need to finish your shift professionally. Can you do that? I nodded again, grateful for her steady presence. Carmen had built her restaurant empire by reading people accurately and making smart decisions quickly. If anyone could help me navigate this disaster, it would be her. Good. Serve them dessert, close out their check, and then we'll talk. And Natalie? She fixed me with those perceptive dark eyes. Remember everything you heard tonight. Every detail. Something tells me you're going to need it. I returned to the dining room with renewed purpose, though my hands still trembled slightly as I approached table 12. David and Vanessa had finished their entrees and were sharing what appeared to be an intimate conversation over the remains of their expensive bottle of wine. How was everything this evening? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Absolutely perfect, Vanessa replied with a satisfied smile. This restaurant is lovely. I'll definitely be recommending it to colleagues. Wonderful, David added, his eyes not quite meeting mine. The food here is really exceptional, honey. You picked a great place to work. The casual endearment felt like a slap across the face. How dare he call me honey while sitting across from the woman he was planning to leave me for? Can I interest you in dessert this evening? I asked, maintaining my professional composure through sheer willpower. They declined dessert, and I processed their check with practiced efficiency. David left a generous tip, probably motivated by guilt rather than appreciation for my service. As they prepared to leave, he stood and gave me a quick kiss on the cheek. I'll see you at home, sweetheart, he said loud enough for other diners to hear. Don't work too hard. Then he walked out of the restaurant with his arm casually around Vanessa's waist, leaving me standing beside their empty table with the weight of their betrayal crushing down on my shoulders. The rest of my shift passed in a blur. I served my remaining tables, cleaned my section, and completed my closing duties like a robot going through programmed motions. But inside, my mind was racing with the implications of everything I'd overheard. David wasn't just having an affair. He was systematically planning to dismantle our entire life together while keeping me completely in the dark until the very last moment. When the restaurant finally closed, Carmen found me sitting at the bar, staring at a glass of water I'd poured but never touched. All right, she said, settling onto the stool beside me. Now tell me what happened. The words tumbled out of me in a chaotic rush, everything I'd overheard spilling across the empty restaurant like wine from a broken bottle. Carmen listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each revelation about David's secret plans. When I finished describing the conversation about Seattle, the divorce timeline, and Vanessa's casual cruelty, the silence stretched between us like a taut wire. That calculating bastard, Carmen finally said, her voice carrying a steel edge I'd never heard before. 7 years of marriage, and he's treating you like a business transaction he wants to dissolve. I wrapped my hands around the water glass, needing something solid to anchor me. The worst part is how stupid I feel. All those late nights, the mysterious phone calls, the way he'd changed the subject when I asked about work. I knew something was off, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Carmen shook her head firmly. You weren't stupid, Natalie. You were trusting your husband, which is what married people are supposed to do. He's the one who betrayed that trust. She paused, studying my face with those perceptive dark eyes. The question now is what you're going to do about it. What can I do? The question came out as barely a whisper. He's already got everything planned. The job, the apartment, even the timing of when he's going to destroy my life. By Christmas, I'll be divorced and he'll be living in Seattle with her. Only if you let him control the narrative, Carmen said, her tone shifting to something more strategic. But what if you took control instead? What if you knew about his plans before he expected you to know? I looked up at her, confused. What do you mean? Carmen stood and walked to the bar's wine refrigerator, retrieving a bottle of Pinot Grigio. She poured 2 glasses and handed me one. I mean that David thinks he has all the power because he thinks you're clueless. But you're not clueless anymore. You know exactly what he's planning, and you heard him admit it all while sitting at my restaurant table. So what? I can't prove any of it. It's just my word against his. Actually, Carmen said, a slow smile spreading across her face, it's not just your word. This is Rosewood Bistro, Natalie. I've been in the restaurant business for 25 years, and I've learned that successful establishments protect themselves in every way possible. She walked to the hostess station and retrieved a small tablet, tapping through several screens before turning it toward me. Security cameras. We have them positioned throughout the dining room, and the audio quality is surprisingly good. Table 12 is covered by 3 different angles. My heart began racing for entirely different reasons now. You recorded their conversation? The system automatically records everything during operating hours. It's primarily for theft prevention and liability protection, but the cameras captured whatever was said at that table tonight. Carmen's smile widened. Including your husband's confession about planning to divorce you, relocate to Seattle, and his admission that he's been deceiving you for months. I stared at the tablet screen, which showed a clear view of table 12 from earlier in the evening. David and Vanessa were frozen in the frame, leaning toward each other in intimate conversation. This is evidence. Real evidence of what they said. Exactly. And as the business owner, I have every right to review our security footage, especially when it involves potential criminal activity occurring on my premises. Criminal activity? Carmen nodded grimly. Financial fraud, for starters. If David has been hiding assets or making financial decisions without your knowledge in preparation for divorce, that's illegal in Oregon. Community property laws require full disclosure. She paused, taking a sip of wine. Plus, if he's been using marital funds for his affair with Vanessa, that's another legal issue entirely. The implications began sinking in. David thought he had orchestrated the perfect plan, but he'd confessed to everything while being recorded by restaurant security cameras. Can we actually use this footage legally? Absolutely. Oregon is a one-party consent state for recordings, and this occurred in a public establishment with posted notices about security monitoring. Everything they said tonight is admissible evidence. Carmen's business acumen was showing, and I began to understand how she'd built such a successful restaurant empire. But we need to be smart about how we use it. What do you mean? Carmen settled back onto her stool, her expression thoughtful. Your husband is a marketing executive. He's good at managing narratives and controlling information flow. If we just confront him with the recording, he'll go into damage control mode. He'll lawyer up, claim the recording was taken out of context, maybe even try to expedite his timeline to minimize your legal options. She was right. David's professional skills extended far beyond advertising campaigns. He was excellent at managing crises and spinning situations to his advantage. Simply playing the recording for him would put him on the defensive, but it wouldn't necessarily stop his plans. So what do you suggest? We gather more evidence first. Tonight's recording is valuable, but it's just one piece of the puzzle. We need to document everything. His financial activities, his travel patterns, his communications with Vanessa. Build a comprehensive case before he realizes we know anything. I felt a spark of hope for the first time since overhearing the conversation. You really think we can do this? Honey, I didn't build this restaurant by letting people walk all over me. I've dealt with cheating suppliers, dishonest employees, and manipulative business partners. Your husband might think he's clever, but he's not the first narcissist I've encountered. Carmen's confidence was infectious. Besides, I like you, Natalie. You're a good person who deserves better than being discarded like yesterday's leftovers. Why are you willing to help me? We barely know each other. Carmen was quiet for a moment, swirling her wine thoughtfully. Because 20 years ago, I was in a similar situation. My first husband thought he could trade me in for a younger model after I'd spent 5 years supporting his failed business ventures. The difference was that I didn't have anyone to help me figure out what was happening until it was almost too late. What did you do? I lost almost everything in the divorce because I didn't prepare properly. He'd hidden assets, moved money around, and by the time I realized what was happening, my legal options were limited. Her expression hardened. I swore that if I ever encountered another woman in that position, I'd make sure she had better information and support than I did. The parallel between our situations was striking. Carmen had rebuilt her life after being betrayed, creating a successful business and establishing herself as a formidable businesswoman. If she could overcome that kind of deception, maybe I could too. What would we need to do? Carmen pulled out a small notebook and began writing. First, we need to document David's current activities. Phone records, credit card statements, travel receipts. Anything that shows a pattern of deception or hidden expenses related to his relationship with Vanessa. I have access to our joint accounts and phone plan. I never thought to look closely at the details before, but I could review everything now. Perfect. Also, we should try to find out more about this job opportunity in Seattle. Morrison and Associates, right? If David hasn't formally accepted the position yet, there might be email communications or documents we can access. I nodded, my mind already racing through the possibilities. David often worked from his home office, and he wasn't particularly careful about securing his computer. If there were emails or contracts related to the Seattle job, I could probably find them. We also need to understand the full scope of his relationship with Vanessa, Carmen continued. How long it's been going on, how often they've met, whether he spent marital money on their affair. That information will be crucial for any divorce proceedings. He mentioned monthly trips to Seattle. I could check his travel records and see if those match up with his claimed business trips for Summit Creative. Excellent. And we should probably get copies of all important financial documents before he has a chance to hide or alter anything. Bank statements, investment accounts, insurance policies, property deeds. The scope of the investigation felt overwhelming, but also empowering. For months, I'd felt like something was wrong with our marriage but couldn't identify the specific problems. Now I had a clear mission and an experienced ally to help me navigate the complexity. How long do you think we have before David makes his move? I asked. Carmen referred back to her notes. Based on what you overheard, he plans to tell you about the divorce after Thanksgiving and wants to be moved to Seattle by Christmas. That gives us about 6 weeks to gather evidence and prepare your response. 6 weeks feels like both forever and no time at all. It's enough if we're methodical and careful. The key is to appear completely normal while we're investigating. David can't suspect that anything has changed in your behavior or awareness. That would be the hardest part. Going home tonight and pretending everything was fine. Acting like a loving wife while knowing that my husband was planning to destroy our marriage. Maintaining normal conversations and routines while secretly documenting his deception. I don't know if I can do that, I admitted. Pretend everything is normal when I know what he's planning. Carmen reached across and squeezed my hand. You're stronger than you think, Natalie. You've been dealing with his lies and manipulation for months without even realizing it. Now you just need to do it consciously and with purpose. What if he notices that I'm acting differently? Then we'll adjust our strategy. But remember, David sees you as someone who's completely trusting and naive. That's actually an advantage now because he won't be looking for signs that you're suspicious. His arrogance works in our favor. She was right. David's confidence in his ability to deceive me had grown over months of successful manipulation. He probably felt completely secure in his planning, never imagining that I might discover his schemes before he was ready to reveal them. There's something else we should consider, Carmen said, her expression becoming more serious. Your husband mentioned that Vanessa's company was offering a relocation package and that the new job would provide money for your divorce settlement. That suggests this isn't just a personal affair. It's also a professional opportunity that benefits both of them financially. What does that mean? It means there might be business ethics violations involved. If Vanessa is using her position at Portland Development Group to offer David favorable employment terms in exchange for personal favors, that could be problematic for both of their careers. The implications were staggering. Not only was David cheating on me, but he was potentially involved in professional misconduct that could affect both his current job and his future prospects. Should we investigate that angle too? Absolutely. If we can document that their affair is connected to business dealings, it gives us additional leverage. Companies don't like scandals, especially ones that involve ethics violations and potential conflicts of interest. Carmen stood and began clearing our wine glasses. For tonight, I want you to go home and act completely normal. Don't mention this conversation, don't change your behavior around David, and definitely don't let on that you know anything about his plans. What about tomorrow? Tomorrow, you start documenting everything. Phone records, financial statements, travel history. Bring whatever you find to work with you, and we'll review it together. I'll also make copies of tonight's security footage and store them safely. I felt a mixture of fear and determination as I gathered my things to leave. The next 6 weeks would test every skill I'd developed over the past 3 months of restaurant work. Attention to detail, grace under pressure, the ability to maintain composure while dealing with difficult situations. Carmen? I paused at the restaurant's front door. Why do you really think we can beat him at his own game? She smiled, but there was steel behind it. Because David is playing by rules that assume you're powerless and ignorant. He's planned his strategy around the assumption that you'll be shocked and unprepared when he reveals his intentions. But now you know what's coming, and you have time to prepare your own strategy. And you think that's enough to level the playing field? Honey, it's enough to tip the playing field entirely in your favor. David might be a good marketing executive, but I've been running successful businesses for decades. I know how to outmaneuver arrogant men who underestimate the women in their lives. As I drove home through the quiet Portland streets, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. The initial shock and devastation of discovering David's betrayal was transforming into something more focused and purposeful. I wasn't just a victim of his deception anymore. I was an active participant in determining how this story would end. David's car was already in our driveway when I arrived home. The house was dark except for the glow of the television from our living room. I took a deep breath, composed my expression into something appropriately tired from a long shift, and walked through the front door. "Hey, sweetheart," David called from the couch, not looking away from the television screen. "How was work tonight?" "Good," I replied, setting down my purse and forcing my voice to sound normal. "Busy, but good tips." "How was your client dinner?" "Really productive. Vanessa Kane seems like she'll be a great addition to our client roster. I think we'll be working together quite a bit in the coming months." The casual way he lied to my face was breathtaking. He was already laying the groundwork for explaining increased contact with Vanessa, probably planning to use their supposed business relationship to cover their personal one. "That's wonderful," I said, settling beside him on the couch. "What kind of projects will you be working on?" "Development consulting, primarily in the Pacific Northwest. Could involve some travel to Seattle, but nothing too disruptive to our routine here." Every word was a carefully constructed deception, designed to normalize the exact changes that would facilitate his escape to a new life with Vanessa. I nodded and smiled, playing my part in his elaborate performance while mentally cataloging each lie for future reference. "I'm exhausted," I said after a few minutes of watching television together. "I think I'll head to bed." David leaned over and kissed my forehead, the gesture feeling like a betrayal even though such displays of affection had been routine throughout our marriage. "Sleep well, babe. I'll be up in a few minutes." As I prepared for bed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me still appeared to be the same Natalie Parker who had left for work 8 hours earlier. But something fundamental had changed. The naive wife who had trusted her husband completely was gone, replaced by someone who understood exactly how cruel and calculating the person she'd married could be. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The next morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. David's alarm buzzed at 6:30, just as it had every weekday for the past 7 years. He showered, dressed in his charcoal suit, and kissed my cheek goodbye while I pretended to be half asleep. The familiar routine felt like watching actors perform a play I'd seen countless times, except now I understood that only one of us had been acting. After his car pulled out of the driveway, I sat up in bed and stared at the ceiling, steeling myself for what needed to be done. The David who had kissed me goodbye was the same man who had casually discussed discarding me like an outdated business strategy. The disconnect was jarring, but it also clarified my mission. If he could maintain such a convincing facade, then I could certainly manage my own performance for the next few weeks. I started with our joint credit card statements, spreading them across the kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle. What I discovered made my stomach turn. Over the past 6 months, there had been dozens of charges I'd never noticed or questioned. Expensive dinners at Seattle restaurants I'd never heard of. Hotel charges for nights when David claimed to be staying with colleagues. Jewelry purchases from high-end boutiques that had never resulted in gifts for me. One particular charge caught my attention. A reservation at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel in Seattle for 3 nights in September, during what David had told me was a conference on digital marketing trends. I remembered that weekend clearly because I'd planned a surprise romantic dinner for his return, wanting to reconnect after he'd seemed distant and distracted. He'd arrived home late and exhausted, claiming the conference had been intensive and draining. Now I realized he'd spent those 3 days with Vanessa while I'd been home missing him and planning gestures to save our marriage. I photographed every suspicious charge with my phone, creating a digital trail that would be impossible for David to explain away. The evidence was damning, but it was also heartbreaking. Each receipt represented another moment when he'd chosen her over me, another lie he'd constructed to cover his tracks. Next, I turned my attention to his phone records, which were accessible through our shared account portal. The patterns that emerged were almost mathematically precise. Every 2 weeks, there would be a cluster of calls to a Seattle number that lasted 30 to 40 minutes. Text messages sent at odd hours, usually late at night or early in the morning. The frequency had increased dramatically over the past 3 months, corresponding with what I now recognized as the period when their relationship had become more serious. Cross-referencing the phone records with our credit card statements revealed an even more detailed timeline. The expensive Seattle dinners always occurred on days when David had multiple lengthy calls to Vanessa's number. The hotel charges aligned perfectly with periods of increased texting activity. He'd been documenting his own affair through our shared financial and communication accounts, apparently confident that I'd never think to look closely at the details. By noon, I had compiled a comprehensive dossier of David's deceptive activities. But gathering evidence was only the first step. I needed to understand the full scope of his plans, particularly the job opportunity in Seattle and his timeline for leaving Portland. David's home office had always been his private domain, but he'd never actively prevented me from entering it. I suspected this was more due to his confidence in my trust than any sophisticated security measures. His computer was password protected, but I knew David well enough to guess his login credentials on the third try. His password was a combination of his birthday and our wedding anniversary, a detail that felt especially cruel given his current plans. His email inbox revealed the true extent of his duplicity. There were months of correspondence with Morrison and Associates regarding a senior marketing director position. The salary being offered was nearly double his current income, with a comprehensive relocation package that included moving expenses, temporary housing, and a signing bonus. The position was essentially created for him, tailored to his specific skills and experience in a way that suggested Vanessa had used her professional influence to arrange the opportunity. Even more revealing were his personal emails with Vanessa. Their correspondence began professionally but quickly evolved into something intimate and strategic. They discussed their relationship in terms that made clear this wasn't a simple affair, but a carefully planned partnership. Vanessa had been instrumental in creating the Seattle job opportunity, while David had been systematically preparing to leave his life in Portland behind. One email thread was particularly illuminating. Vanessa had written, "The lawyers I consulted said Oregon's no-fault divorce laws will work in your favor, especially since Natalie doesn't have significant individual assets. If you can establish Seattle residency before filing, Washington's community property rules might be more favorable for protecting your new income level." David's response was coldly calculated. "I've been keeping detailed financial records to show that most of our joint assets came from my income and career advancement. Natalie's restaurant job actually helps establish that she's capable of self-support post-divorce. I think we can minimize alimony obligations if we handle the timing correctly." They were discussing my life and future as if I were a business liability to be minimized rather than a person who'd spent 7 years building a life with David. The clinical nature of their planning was almost more hurtful than the affair itself. I printed copies of the most damaging emails and stored them in a folder I hid behind some old textbooks in our bedroom closet. Then I carefully cleared the browser history and closed David's computer, leaving no trace of my investigation. That afternoon, I drove to Rosewood Bistro for my shift, my head spinning with everything I'd discovered. Carmen was in her office when I arrived, and she immediately noticed my expression. "You found something," she said, closing her laptop and giving me her full attention. I spread the printed emails across her desk, along with screenshots of the financial evidence I'd compiled. Carmen read through everything methodically, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair with a low whistle. "This is even worse than what we overheard last night," she said. "They've been planning this for at least 6 months, and they've been using his current marriage to facilitate the transition to their new life together." The part about minimizing alimony obligations made me feel sick, I admitted. "He's been calculating exactly how little he can get away with giving me." "Actually, that might work in our favor," Carmen said thoughtfully. "If he's been hiding assets or manipulating the financial picture to reduce his obligations, that's fraud. Oregon courts don't look kindly on spouses who try to cheat the system. She pulled out a business card and handed it to me. This is Grace Bennett, the attorney I mentioned. I called her this morning and explained the general situation. She's agreed to meet with you confidentially to review what we found and advise on legal strategy. I looked at the card, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. Making an appointment with a divorce attorney felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. It transformed this from gathering information into actively preparing for the end of my marriage. She can see you tomorrow afternoon, Carmen continued. I'll adjust the schedule so you can leave early. The consultation is completely confidential, and she'll help us understand what additional evidence might be useful. What if David finds out I'm meeting with a lawyer? He won't. Grace is discreet, and her office is downtown, nowhere near David's workplace. As far as he knows, you're just working your regular shifts and living your normal life. That evening service was busy, which helped keep my mind occupied. But I found myself studying the other couples in the restaurant, wondering if any of them were harboring the kind of secrets that David had been keeping from me. How many seemingly normal relationships were actually elaborate performances covering betrayal and deception? During a brief lull, Marcus approached me at the service station. He was Carmen's most trusted employee, a man in his 40s who'd worked his way up from busser to head server over 8 years at Rosewood Bistro. Carmen told me a little about your situation, he said quietly. I want you to know that if you need anything, backup, witnesses, whatever, you've got support here. I was touched by his offer, but also curious. Why would you want to get involved? Marcus glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard. Because I went through something similar 5 years ago. My ex-wife had been planning to leave me for months, moving money around, even consulting lawyers, while pretending everything was fine at home. If I'd had people looking out for me back then, maybe I wouldn't have lost my house and half my retirement savings. His experience reinforced what Carmen had told me about being prepared before David made his move. How did you find out what she was doing? I didn't, until it was too late. One day I came home and found divorce papers on the kitchen table along with a note saying she'd moved in with her boyfriend. Turned out she'd been planning it for 8 months, but I was completely blindsided. Marcus shook his head ruefully. The worst part was realizing that all those conversations about our future, all those discussions about retirement plans and vacation dreams, were just her way of keeping me distracted while she arranged her exit strategy. The parallels to my situation were unsettling. David's recent enthusiasm for discussing our home renovation projects and holiday travel plans suddenly took on a different meaning. He'd been keeping me focused on future plans that he had no intention of honoring, using my excitement about our shared dreams to prevent me from noticing his actual preparations. The difference is that you know what's coming, Marcus continued. You have time to prepare your own strategy instead of just reacting to his. That's a huge advantage if you use it wisely. When I arrived home that night, David was in his office with the door closed, speaking quietly on the phone. I could hear the murmur of his voice but couldn't make out specific words. Based on everything I'd learned, I suspected he was talking to Vanessa, probably discussing their plans while I was safely out of earshot working my evening shift. I went to the kitchen and began preparing a late dinner, listening to the rhythm of his conversation through the closed door. When he finally emerged 20 minutes later, his expression was relaxed and satisfied. Sorry about that, he said, kissing my forehead. Client emergency. You know how it is. Another lie delivered so casually that I marveled at his ability to maintain the deception. Of course. I saved you some pasta if you're hungry. We ate dinner together while David told me about his day, a mixture of real workplace anecdotes and carefully constructed fiction about his interactions with various clients. I found myself analyzing every story, trying to determine which parts were true and which were designed to reinforce his cover story about expanding business relationships in the Seattle market. Actually, he said as we were cleaning up, I might need to take another trip up to Seattle next week. This Vanessa Kane project is developing faster than expected, and she wants to introduce me to some of her colleagues at Portland Development Group. I nodded sympathetically while internally noting another piece of evidence for my growing file. That's exciting. It sounds like this relationship could really benefit your career. Definitely. She's been incredibly helpful in opening doors and making connections. I think working with her company could be a real game changer for Summit Creative's Pacific Northwest presence. The way he talked about Vanessa as a professional contact while planning a personal future with her was masterful manipulation. He was conditioning me to accept their increased contact as a natural result of business development, laying groundwork that would make their eventual relationship revelation seem like an unexpected development rather than a long-planned affair. "How long do you think you'll be traveling back and forth?" I asked, testing how much he was willing to reveal about his timeline. David considered the question carefully, probably calculating how much information he could share without arousing suspicion. "Hard to say. Could be several months of regular trips while we develop the partnership. But if things go well, there might be opportunities for more permanent collaboration." More permanent collaboration. Even his euphemisms were crafted to gradually introduce the concept of major life changes without triggering immediate alarm. He was a master of managing information flow, revealing his plans in carefully measured doses that wouldn't overwhelm my supposed trust and naivety. That night, as David slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling and marveled at his ability to compartmentalize. He could plan the destruction of our marriage during the day, then come home and perform the role of loving husband so convincingly that even knowing the truth, I sometimes found myself responding to his affection automatically. But I was learning to compartmentalize too. During the day, I was gathering evidence and building alliances. In the evening, I was playing the role of unsuspecting wife while mentally cataloging each lie and deception. The difference was that my performance had a purpose beyond self-preservation. I was working toward justice and truth, not prolonging a destructive deception. My appointment with Grace Bennett was scheduled for 3 o'clock the following afternoon. Carmen had arranged for Tony, one of our part-time servers, to cover my section so I could leave early. As I drove downtown to the attorney's office, I felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. This meeting would transform my investigation from personal discovery into legal preparation. Grace Bennett's office was located in a sleek building near Pioneer Courthouse Square. She was a woman in her late 40s with silver hair and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her handshake was firm and confident, and her manner was both professional and warmly reassuring. "Carmen filled me in on the basic situation," she said as we settled in her conference room. "But I'd like you to tell me the story in your own words, starting from the beginning." I recounted the events of the past 2 days, from overhearing the conversation at the restaurant to discovering the emails and financial evidence. Grace listened without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad and occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and specific details. When I finished, she reviewed the evidence I'd brought, studying the printed emails and financial records with practiced efficiency. Her expression grew more serious as she read through David's correspondence with Vanessa and the documentation of his spending patterns. "This is quite comprehensive," she said finally. "And very damaging to your husband's position. He's essentially documented his own misconduct through his communications and financial activities." "What does that mean legally?" Grace leaned back in her chair, organizing her thoughts. "Oregon is a no-fault divorce state, which means infidelity alone doesn't affect property division or support obligations. However, financial misconduct during marriage is a different matter entirely. If your husband has been using marital assets to fund his relationship with another woman, that constitutes waste of marital property." She pointed to several of the credit card statements I'd brought. "These charges for expensive dinners, hotels, and gifts that weren't for you represent marital funds used for his personal benefit outside the marriage. In Oregon, the court can order reimbursement for that waste, essentially requiring him to pay back the money he spent on his affair." "What about his plans to minimize alimony by establishing residency in Seattle?" "That's where his own emails work against him," Grace said with a slight smile. "He's documented his intention to manipulate the legal system for financial advantage, which courts view very unfavorably. If we can show that he was planning to relocate specifically to avoid his obligations to you, that becomes evidence of bad faith in divorce proceedings." The legal implications were encouraging, but I was also concerned about the practical challenges. "He's still planning to blindside me after Thanksgiving. Even with all this evidence, won't he have some advantages if he controls the timing of the divorce filing?" "Not if we file first," Grace said calmly. Once we have a complete picture of your assets and his plans, we can file for divorce before he expects it. That puts you in the driver's seat legally and prevents him from implementing his strategy of relocating before the proceedings begin. The idea of filing for divorce before David even realized I knew about his plans was both thrilling and terrifying. It represented taking complete control of a situation where I'd felt powerless and deceived. How long would we have to prepare? I asked. Grace consulted her calendar. Based on what you've told me about his timeline, I'd recommend filing within the next 3 weeks. That gives us time to gather any additional evidence and complete financial discovery, while still beating his planned revelation by several weeks. What kind of additional evidence would be helpful? We need complete documentation of all marital assets and debts. Bank statements, investment accounts, retirement funds, property valuations. Also, if possible, more evidence of the scope and duration of his relationship with Vanessa. The more we can prove about their planning and coordination, the stronger your case becomes. I left Grace's office with a detailed list of documents to gather and a timeline for preparation. The legal strategy was becoming clear, but I still needed to maintain my cover while assembling the final pieces of evidence. That evening at Rosewood Bistro, Carmen and I reviewed the meeting with Grace during a quiet moment in the kitchen. Marcus had volunteered to help with any additional evidence gathering, and even Tony had offered to cover extra shifts if I needed time for legal preparation. It's amazing how quickly this has evolved, Carmen observed. 3 days ago, you were just dealing with the shock of discovery. Now you're building a comprehensive legal strategy. I keep wondering if I'm moving too fast, I admitted. Part of me thinks I should confront David directly, give him a chance to explain or change his plans. Carmen shook her head firmly. Natalie, you heard him with your own ears. He called you naive and trusting, and he was proud of how easily he'd been able to deceive you. This isn't a man who's going to suddenly develop honesty and remorse if you give him the opportunity. She was right. David's planning had been too methodical, too calculated, and too long-term to be the result of temporary poor judgment. He'd been building toward this betrayal for months, carefully constructing lies and manipulating circumstances to facilitate his escape to a new life with Vanessa. Besides, Carmen continued, Grace is right about the timing. If you wait for David to make his move, you lose control of the situation. Right now, you have information he doesn't know you possess, and that's a powerful advantage. As my shift ended and I prepared to go home to another evening of performance and deception, I felt a growing sense of purpose. The naive wife who had trusted blindly was gone, replaced by someone who understood the importance of preparation, evidence, and strategic thinking. David's elaborate plan depended on my ignorance and passivity. But I was no longer ignorant, and I was definitely not passive. In 2 weeks, when he least expected it, I would turn his own tactics against him and show him exactly what happened when someone underestimated Natalie Parker. The following weekend brought an unexpected development that changed everything. David announced over Saturday morning coffee that he'd been invited to a company retreat at a resort in Cannon Beach, just 2 hours from Portland. The timing seemed perfect for gathering final evidence, but as the weekend unfolded, I discovered something that transformed my carefully planned strategy into something far more urgent and personal. It's a leadership development weekend, David explained as he packed his overnight bag. Team building exercises, strategic planning sessions, that sort of thing. Should be back Sunday evening. I helped him pack, playing the supportive wife while mentally noting this as another opportunity to search through his belongings and computer files. But something about his demeanor felt different this weekend. He seemed nervous in a way that didn't match his usual confidence when lying to me. After he left, I immediately went to his office and accessed his computer. What I found in his recent email drafts made my blood run cold. He'd been corresponding with a realtor in Seattle about rental properties, and the timeline had accelerated dramatically. Instead of planning to leave after Christmas, several emails suggested he was considering making his move as early as Thanksgiving weekend. One draft email to Vanessa was particularly alarming. The Cannon Beach retreat is the perfect cover for finalizing everything in Seattle. I can drive up Saturday night after the sessions and we can sign the lease agreement Sunday morning. By the time I get back to Portland, we'll have secured the apartment and I can start the conversation with Natalie sooner than planned. My hands trembled as I read the implications. David wasn't at a company retreat. He was spending the weekend in Seattle with Vanessa, making the final arrangements for their new life together. More importantly, he was planning to confront me about the divorce within days rather than weeks. I printed the email drafts and called Carmen immediately, my voice shaking as I explained the development. She arrived at my house within 30 minutes, accompanied by Marcus, who had offered to help with any emergency situations that might arise. "This changes everything," Carmen said after reviewing the printed emails. "If he's planning to tell you about the divorce next week, we don't have time to gather additional evidence. We need to implement our strategy immediately." "What does that mean?" Marcus answered grimly. "It means we accelerate the timeline. Instead of waiting for you to file divorce papers first, we need to confront him with everything we know before he has a chance to control the narrative." The prospect was terrifying. I'd been preparing for a controlled legal process where I maintained the element of surprise until the very end. Now I was facing the possibility of a direct confrontation where David might be able to manipulate the situation or escape consequences through his superior planning and resources. "There's something else," Carmen said, her expression troubled. "I received a call this morning from Patricia Wells, who owns the boutique hotel downtown. She mentioned that a man fitting David's description has been making inquiries about hosting a private event there. Something about a celebration dinner for business associates." The implication hit me like a physical blow. He's planning to announce his new job and relationship at some kind of party. "It gets worse," Marcus added quietly. "Patricia said he specifically asked about availability for the weekend after Thanksgiving. He's not just planning to leave you. He's planning to celebrate leaving you, probably with Vanessa and their mutual friends." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. David wasn't content with simply ending our marriage and moving to Seattle. He wanted to mark the occasion with a celebration, turning the destruction of our 7-year relationship into a festive occasion for his new social circle. But something else was bothering me, a nagging feeling that there were still pieces of this puzzle I hadn't discovered. I asked Carmen and Marcus to help me search through David's office more thoroughly, looking for any documents or information that might explain the rushed timeline and elaborate planning. In the back of his filing cabinet, behind old tax returns and insurance documents, I found a folder labeled Strategic Planning that contained information I'd never seen before. Inside were financial projections, property assessments, and what appeared to be a comprehensive analysis of our marital assets and their potential division in divorce proceedings. But the most shocking discovery was a series of printed emails between David and someone named Jonathan Mills, who appeared to be a private investigator. The correspondence revealed that David had been having me professionally surveilled for the past 2 months, documenting my daily routines, work schedule, and social interactions. "He hired a private investigator to spy on me," I said, my voice barely audible as I shared the emails with Carmen and Marcus. The investigation had been thorough and invasive. Jonathan Mills had documented my shifts at Rosewood Bistro, my grocery shopping patterns, even my conversations with neighbors. The reports painted a picture of someone leading a simple, predictable life with no hidden assets or suspicious activities. But there was also a more sinister purpose to the surveillance. The investigator had been specifically tasked with documenting any behavior that could be used to challenge my fitness as a spouse or my entitlement to marital assets. David had been building a case against me while I'd been completely unaware I was being investigated. "This explains why he's been so confident about the divorce outcome," Carmen said angrily. "He's been gathering evidence to use against you while keeping you in the dark about his own misconduct." One email from the investigator was particularly troubling. Subject: maintains regular employment at Rosewood Bistro and appears financially independent. No evidence of substance abuse, infidelity, or fiscal irresponsibility. However, her trust in her husband's activities suggests potential naivety that could be exploited in legal proceedings. David had paid someone to document my trust in him as a character flaw that could be used against me in court. The violation felt even deeper than his affair with Vanessa. He'd turned my love and faith in our marriage into ammunition for destroying me legally and financially. "There's more," Marcus said, pointing to another section of the folder. "Look at these property assessments." The documents revealed that David had been having our house appraised by multiple real estate agents, apparently preparing to argue for its sale and division of proceeds. But the timing was suspicious. All the appraisals had been conducted while I was at work, without my knowledge or consent. Even more disturbing was a letter from a property management company confirming that David had already listed our house for sale, with a target closing date of January 15th. He hadn't just been planning to leave me. He'd been planning to force me out of our home before I could even process what was happening. "He's been systematically dismantling your entire life," Carmen said, her voice filled with outrage. "The job in Seattle, the apartment with Vanessa, the divorce timeline, even selling your house. None of this is impulsive or emotional. It's been calculated and planned like a military operation." The scope of David's deception was overwhelming, but it also clarified something important. This wasn't about him falling in love with someone else or being unhappy in our marriage. This was about him wanting a completely different life and viewing me as an obstacle to be efficiently removed rather than a person deserving honesty and respect. But as we continued searching through his files, I found something that changed my understanding of the situation entirely. Hidden in a manila envelope at the very back of the cabinet was a life insurance policy I'd never seen before. David had increased his coverage to $2 million just 6 months earlier, with me listed as the primary beneficiary. At first, this seemed like a positive discovery. If David died, it would be financially secure regardless of how the divorce proceedings unfolded. But as I read through the policy details, a chilling realization began to form. The policy had a specific clause about suicide exclusions and accidental death benefits. More troubling, there were notes in David's handwriting about outdoor activities and travel insurance, along with what appeared to be research about climbing accidents and their statistical likelihood. "Carmen," I said quietly, "I think David might be planning something more than just divorce." She read through the insurance documents, her expression growing increasingly alarmed. "Natalie, this looks like someone researching how to stage an accident." The implications were terrifying. If David was planning to fake his own death, it would allow him to escape all legal and financial obligations while leaving me with a substantial insurance payout that would prevent me from pursuing him legally. He could start a new life with Vanessa while officially being declared dead, creating the perfect escape from consequences. "We need to call the police," Marcus said immediately. "This goes way beyond divorce fraud. If he's planning to fake his death, that's insurance fraud and potentially much worse." But Carmen held up a hand. "We need to be careful here. Right now, we have evidence of planning and research, but no actual crime has been committed. If we go to the police prematurely, David might accelerate whatever he's planning or find a way to destroy the evidence. So what do we do?" Carmen was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing our options. "We need more definitive proof of his intentions. And we need to make sure that whatever David is planning, he doesn't get the chance to implement it." The discovery of the insurance policy transformed our situation from a divorce preparation into something much more serious and dangerous. David wasn't just planning to leave me. He was potentially planning to disappear entirely, leaving me to deal with the aftermath while he lived freely under a new identity with Vanessa. That evening, as I waited for David to return from his supposed company retreat, I felt a fear I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just about betrayal or financial manipulation anymore. This was about my safety and potentially my life. When David's car pulled into the driveway at 8:30 that night, I was sitting in the living room with a book, trying to appear normal despite the turmoil raging inside me. He entered the house with his usual confident manner, but I noticed scratches on his hands that hadn't been there when he left. "How was the retreat?" I asked, studying his face for any signs of deception. "Really productive," he replied, setting down his overnight bag. "Lots of good team-building exercises and strategic planning sessions. I feel much clearer about my direction moving forward." His choice of words seemed loaded with double meaning. Direction moving forward could refer to corporate strategy or personal life plans. I noticed he avoided making eye contact as he spoke, a tell I'd learned to recognize over the years. "What kind of activities did they have you doing?" I pressed gently. "Oh, trust exercises, communication workshops, some outdoor activities to build camaraderie." He rolled up his sleeves as he spoke, and I could see more scratches on his forearms. There was a rock climbing component that was pretty challenging. Rock climbing. My blood ran cold as I remembered the insurance policy notes about climbing accidents. David had never shown any interest in rock climbing before, but suddenly he was participating in climbing activities during a weekend that had potentially been spent finalizing plans with Vanessa. That sounds exciting, I managed. Did you enjoy the climbing? David's expression became animated in a way that seemed forced. Actually, yeah. It was more challenging than I expected, but really rewarding. I'm thinking about taking it up as a regular hobby. There are some great climbing areas in the Pacific Northwest. The Pacific Northwest. Where he was planning to move with Vanessa. Where climbing accidents might be easier to stage convincingly. As David unpacked his bag and settled into our evening routine, I watched him with new eyes. This wasn't just a cheating husband anymore. This was potentially a man planning something far more dangerous and elaborate than simple divorce fraud. Later that night, after David had fallen asleep, I carefully checked his overnight bag for any additional evidence. What I found confirmed my worst fears. There were climbing gear receipts from a Seattle outdoor equipment store, along with what appeared to be research printouts about climbing safety statistics and accident reporting procedures. But the most chilling discovery was a business card for a travel insurance company, with handwritten notes about coverage limits for accidental death during outdoor activities. David wasn't just researching climbing as a hobby. He was researching how to make a climbing accident appear accidental and ensure maximum insurance payouts. I took photos of everything with my phone, being careful not to disturb the arrangement of items in his bag. Then I sat in our bathroom with the door locked, scrolling through the evidence and trying to process the magnitude of what David was apparently planning. This wasn't just about wanting a new life with Vanessa. This was about erasing his old life entirely, leaving no legal obligations or financial responsibilities behind. If he successfully faked his death, he could start fresh with a new identity while I received an insurance payout that would prevent me from having any reason to look for him. The plan was diabolical in its completeness. I would be too shocked by his supposed death to immediately question the circumstances. The insurance money would provide financial security, making me less likely to pursue legal action or investigation. And Vanessa could comfort me through my grief while secretly building a new life with David under whatever identity he'd assumed. As I sat there in the dark bathroom, surrounded by evidence of my husband's elaborate deception, I realized that everything I'd thought I knew about David had been wrong. He wasn't just selfish or unfaithful. He was capable of planning something that could destroy multiple lives while serving his own interests. But he'd made one critical mistake. He'd assumed I would remain naive and trusting until the very end, never questioning his activities or investigating his behavior. Instead, I discovered his plans before he could implement them, and now I had the information needed to stop him. The question was whether I could do it in time, and whether I could do it safely. David's plan was complex and carefully researched, but it depended on maintaining the element of surprise. Now that I knew what he was planning, I had the advantage of preparation and allies who could help me turn his own strategy against him. Tomorrow, I would meet with Carmen and Grace to develop a response that would not only protect me legally and financially, but potentially save my life. David thought he was playing a game where only he knew the rules. But the game was about to change dramatically, and this time, I would be the one controlling the outcome. Monday morning arrived with crystalline clarity. I had spent Sunday coordinating with Carmen, Grace, and even contacted Detective Rodriguez from Portland Police about the insurance fraud evidence. Everything was in place for the most important performance of my life. David left for work as usual, kissing my cheek and promising to be home by 6 for what he called an important conversation. He had no idea that I already knew exactly what conversation he was planning, or that I had spent the weekend preparing my own surprise. At exactly 5:30, I arrived at Rosewood Bistro carrying a leather portfolio and wearing my best black dress. Carmen had arranged for us to use the private dining room, and Grace was already there with Detective Rodriguez and a court clerk who would serve as our witness. "Are you ready for this?" Carmen asked, squeezing my shoulder. "More than ready," I replied, feeling a calm determination I'd never experienced before. At 6:15, David walked through the restaurant's front door, clearly expecting to find me waiting tables. Instead, Marcus approached him at the hostess station. "Mr. Parker? Your wife is waiting for you in the private dining room. Right this way." I watched through the service window as David's confident expression faltered. He'd planned to control every aspect of our conversation, choosing the time, location, and revelation sequence. Finding himself directed to an unexpected setting had already disrupted his strategy. When he entered the private dining room and saw me seated at the head of a long table with several other people, his face went completely pale. "Natalie, what's going on? Who are these people?" "Please sit down, David. We have a lot to discuss." I gestured to the chair directly across from me. "I believe you were planning to have an important conversation with me tonight. But I thought it would be better to have that conversation with some additional context." David remained standing, his eyes darting between the unfamiliar faces around the table. "I don't understand what this is." "This is Grace Bennett, my attorney. Detective Rodriguez from Portland Police. And Carmen Rodriguez, who owns this restaurant where you had such an enlightening dinner with Vanessa Kane 2 weeks ago." The color drained entirely from David's face as he realized the implications. "You've been spying on me." "Actually, you've been spying on me," I replied calmly, opening my portfolio. "Jonathan Mills sends very thorough reports. Did you know he documented my conversations with neighbors? My grocery shopping patterns? Even noted that my trust in my husband suggested potential naivety that could be exploited in legal proceedings." David sank into the chair, his composure finally cracking. "Natalie, I can explain everything." "I'm sure you can. You're excellent at explanations. Like explaining why you spent our savings on romantic dinners in Seattle. Or why you've been researching climbing accidents and life insurance policies. Or why you've already listed our house for sale without telling me." Each revelation hit him like a physical blow. His marketing executive confidence was dissolving, replaced by the panic of someone whose elaborate plans were unraveling in real time. Detective Rodriguez leaned forward. "Mr. Parker, we need to discuss your recent research into insurance fraud and the climbing equipment purchases you made in Seattle this weekend." "That's not. I was just exploring a new hobby." David's voice was weak, unconvincing even to himself. "A hobby that coincidentally aligns with life insurance policy changes and research into accidental death benefits?" Grace interjected. "We have documented evidence of your planning, David. The question now is whether you want to cooperate or let this proceed through criminal channels." I watched my husband of 7 years completely collapse under the weight of his own deception. This man who had planned to discard me like an outdated business strategy was now begging for mercy from the very person he'd systematically betrayed. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. "I want honesty," I said firmly. "I want you to admit what you've been planning and agree to a fair divorce settlement that reflects your actual financial misconduct." Over the next hour, David confessed to everything. The affair with Vanessa, the job arrangement in Seattle, the timeline for abandoning our marriage, even the insurance fraud planning that could have endangered my life. Grace recorded every word while Detective Rodriguez took notes for potential criminal charges. By 8 o'clock, David had signed divorce papers that gave me everything. The house, his retirement accounts, and compensation for the marital funds he'd wasted on his affair. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue criminal charges for the insurance fraud conspiracy. As David left the restaurant that night, defeated and exposed, he paused at the door. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Long enough," I replied. "Long enough to learn that I'm much stronger and smarter than you ever gave me credit for." 6 months later, I was sitting in the same private dining room at Rosewood Bistro, but this time for a celebration. Carmen had offered me a management position, and I'd used David's settlement money to invest in the restaurant as a partner. The naive wife who had trusted blindly was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept less than she deserved. David's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also freed me from a marriage built on lies and shown me capabilities I never knew I possessed. As I raised a glass of wine with Carmen and our staff, I realized that David's elaborate plan had backfired completely. He'd intended to leave me with nothing, but instead, he'd given me everything I needed to build a better life. His greatest mistake was underestimating the woman he thought he could easily discard. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be the victim someone expected you to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.